A new report shows that Hurricane Maria is officially the deadliest natural disaster to hit the United States in the last century. The Puerto Rican government commissioned the independent report conducted by researchers at George Washington University. It found Hurricane Maria was responsible for an estimated 2,975 deaths after making landfall last September. David Begnaud spoke with officials and families in San Juan.
It just got me sad.
Nicole Cordero told us that her 47-year-old mother, Wanda, indirectly died as a result of Hurricane Maria. Wanda had pancreatitis and needed oxygen when the power went out at the hospital where she was being treated.
I wish the hospitals were more prepared.
A government-commissioned review done by George Washington University researchers looked at the 6 months after Hurricane Maria and compared the number of deaths to the same time period in 7 previous years. The findings bumped the official death toll from an estimated 64 to 2,975. The mayor of San Juan called the new report painful and shameful and said the governor should take more responsibility.
When I saw people dying, I opted to shout it. I opted to ask for help. When others saw people dying, they opted to shut up.
Governor Ricardo Rosselló acknowledged Tuesday that he's made mistakes.
The focus shouldn't be, hey, let's blame all these folks. The focus should be who's going to be accountable and who's going to take the action so that this doesn't happen again.
Researchers found that the government and hospitals were inadequately prepared for the Category 4 storm. They also found that the risk of death was 45% higher for those living in low-income areas on the island, and that elderly men were at the greatest risk of dying. But there were young people who were otherwise healthy, like 29-year-old Ramsey Romero, who also died. His brother Christian told us that Ramsey contracted a treatable bacterial disease. He had been helping his community clean up after the hurricane.
I think
the government was negligent, Christian told us.
What does your brother deserve?
I think my brother deserves justice.
David Begnaud is with us now from San Juan, Puerto Rico. So, David, we all remember that first number of 64, and it truly seemed miraculous that only 64 people would have died with such a powerful storm descending on this island. Now we hear a much different number. Explain the disparity between the two numbers.
Well, the government was basing the 64 off of storms that were off of deaths that were directly related to the hurricane. So people who died maybe in flooding or a landslide or were hit by flying debris. The study from George Washington University actually looked at indirect deaths, right? So deaths that may have been caused because of a lack of power or a lack of water or an inability to get dialysis. So it's the indirect deaths that the government was not initially looking at. And the report also highlighted the fact that the government's way of certifying deaths was flawed, misinformed, and quite frankly, uneducated. The government had no one who understood the proper death certification process when it came to natural disasters. And doctors told researchers from George Washington University that they had no training in it. They couldn't get training from the government. And some of the doctors told the researchers that they were afraid of being sued. So on some death certificates, they gave maybe 1, 2 causes of death. They didn't make it clear that it was a storm-related death, in their opinion. I talked to a FEMA expert this morning, an official at FEMA, and I said, what happens with this now? Because we have a list of 2,975, right? But we don't have a list of names, a list of people. But FEMA will pay death benefits in this way. Let's say, Anne Marie, your grandmother died in the storm, and you've got $1,000 that you need to pay the funeral home that you can't afford to pay. FEMA will step in and pay it if they believe that your grandmother's death was in some way caused by the storm. Well, how do we prove that your grandmother is on that list? How do we prove it if her death certificate doesn't say that it was storm related, right? So if it says respiratory distress, how do we know it was an indirect death? So the man from FEMA told me today, he goes, David, this further complicates the process for us. It tells us we have far more death benefits that we may need to pay out, but we don't know what to verify and where. He goes, we could be dealing with this for years.
Wow. And I know you spoke to Puerto Rico's governor, Ricardo Rosselló, yesterday, and you asked him, well, who is responsible for this death toll then? This is what he had to say.
Well, there's plenty of responsibility to go around. I have my share of responsibility. I'm the governor of Puerto Rico, and I have to evaluate everything, all of the steps that I've taken, see in the report, and the places where I need to improve. We're going to work hard to make sure that on a future event, it doesn't, it's not as devastating as right now. The fact that a lot of this, the preparation for Puerto Rico, the protocols that were in place, really were only established for an event of a much lower magnitude than
Category 1.
Category 1.
They were prepared for a Category 1. In what ways was Puerto Rico unprepared for Hurricane Maria?
Oh my God. They had no way of talking to local mayors anywhere. Okay? There was no power, there was no water, the hospitals were in crisis, 911 wasn't functioning, ambulances couldn't get to where they needed to go, people couldn't call the ambulance, and the ambulance drivers in many cases were stuck in their own homes. I mean, listen, nothing was working. There's no hyperbole here. It literally was the absolute worst case scenario. Let me tell you one story the governor told me. He saw a tweet from NOAA, right, the federal agency that said the Guajataca Dam on the western side of the island was in jeopardy of failing. He told me, David, I was sitting in the governor's mansion. We saw the tweet, and I said, how do we confirm it? I can't call the mayor. I can't reach anybody. He could not call anybody. Think about that. There were no radios for him to communicate with anybody at any level. So what did he do? He had his detail put him in a car and drive him to the western side of the island so the man himself could look at the dam and figure out what the story was. I mean, that is fascinating when you think in modern times that things can be that broken down, right? But the preparation was so ill-made, Anne-Marie. I mean, they were only prepared for a Category 1 storm. They had no satellite phones. They had no way to communicate with the mayors. I mean, it literally was the worst case scenario. And look, I also want to point out, so much has been made about the public safety director, Hector Pesquera, a former FBI agent in Miami who now runs things. He was handling this death certification process, and he was pushing back on us so hard last year, journalists, when we would say, how do you know it's 64? Are you sure it's not higher? And man, he would come ripping and roar, and he'd say, you have no way of proving it. We rely on the doctors, and that's the process. Well, come to find out, now we know the doctors didn't even have the proper training. And I asked the governor yesterday, will you fire Mr. Pesquera? He definitely did not commit to firing him and didn't even suggest that he would. But he acknowledged that Mr. Pesquera consistently gave misinformation. Consistently. Now, he argues that Pesquera gave the best information that he had at the time. But the bottom line is it was wrong. Mr. Pesquera really had no training to be speaking on the issue. The governor admits that. But week after week, we got misinformation on this death count. And 64, it should have never been 64. Ever, ever, ever. And now you've got this 2,975, and we don't even have a list of names. There's no names. It's just a number, and people are asking, is my grandma on that list? Is that my dad?
Yeah, I feel like, once we saw the level of devastation, it was pretty obvious that it wasn't going to be just a few dozen people on that list of people killed by this storm. But the governor also says that they're ready to implement the suggestions found in this report. So what sort of changes were recommended?
You're right. Okay, I'm glad you brought that up. So the governor has signed an executive order that creates a commission to implement the suggestions in the report. Let me tell you, I read every word of that report. They did not hold back. If you thought that George Washington University, because they were being paid by the government to do the study, would in some way soften the blow, or they didn't. They laid out every single thing that was wrong, and they laid out every single thing that they thought should be implemented. So the governor says he will implement it. He's going to create the commission, some of whom on the commission will comprise of his representatives. But more importantly, he's going to go and get the experts. That's what they need, Anne-Marie. They need the people who actually know what they're talking about when it comes to disaster management and certification in mortality. So he's going to put those people on a commission and implement it. And it's our job to keep them accountable and make sure that it actually happens. The governor, again, the executive order has been signed. We'll see. It's interesting that we're having this conversation in the middle of another hurricane season, though. It's a year since Maria. We're in another season, exactly. And they're just now talking about implementing things.
Yeah, I mean, the clock is ticking. Before I let you go, we remember, David, when the administration characterized this Hurricane Maria hitting Puerto Rico as a good news story. Now we know the numbers were radically off in terms of the death toll. Have you heard anything from the administration?
So President Trump, who tweets regularly, has not tweeted anything about Puerto Rico. He has not said anything directly related to this new death toll. However, the White House put out a statement yesterday saying that President Trump was proud of the federal response. Beyond that, we have not heard anything. FEMA has put out a statement saying we're happy with the work we did. Remember, they were heavily criticized, right? The response was slow. The resources were late to arrive. They know it and they've admitted it, okay? And that definitely, according to the governor, and according to a lot of people, quite frankly, on this island, that costs lives. Not my opinion. That comes from the governor and that comes from people who live here. But if you talk to the federal government, nobody's falling on the sword publicly. Maybe behind the scenes, but not publicly.
Well, David, it certainly seems, according to that report, there were multiple failures in multiple areas. You rightly pointed out we are in the middle of a hurricane season and there is no room for error for Puerto Rico at all. David Begnaud, thank you so much.
You bet.